episode 18 of Black, Brown, Yellow, White. And today I'm very happy and very excited to have with us the acclaimed writer Phenderson Djèli Clark. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Did.
Thank you very much. And maybe for starters, you could just give us a little idea of who you are, what you're doing, so we have an idea of our main protagonist today.
Yeah. So my name is Phenderson Djèli Clark, sometimes P. Djèli Clark. I'm a writer of speculative fiction, and I write across genres of fantasy, horror, steampunk, and when I'm not doing that, I'm also an academic historian. So I have two writing lives.
Okay. And given that in your at least one of your professions you have to be highly creative, what are like your sources of inspiration, very generally speaking, also people,
Yeah.
artwork, whatever.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, at the end of the day, I think I came to writing because I read a lot. And so when I was a kid, I was doing all kinds of reading, Ursula Le Guin and J.R. Tolkien and all of
Yeah.
these, works people know. And so, a lot of reading certainly was inspiring. Comic books, I was a big X-Men fan and
Yeah.
Marvel. And so my comic books were inspiring. So were endless movies as a kid, like The Dark Crystal and things like that.
Mm.
Just, were always the things that piqued my interest. And I think in my own writing, I probably pull from a lot of those, even if
Mhm.
people may not notice them. I pull
Yeah.
from old books, old movies, and modern ones as well, right? I think they're always influences. And so, I think there's always an influence out there. There's always some kind of source
Mhm.
that will feed the muse, as I say.
And are there also people, like let's just say flesh and blood people from your immediate networks or from the wider world that gave you some
Yeah, sure.
impetus?
I mean, I have a wonderful wife who's also into reading and speculative fiction.
Mhm.
She's also a writer, and so she's always there to read my manuscripts and my
Yeah.
stories. There are a lot of my mother was I think one of the first people who introduced me to like the old black and white Twilight Zones and
Mhm.
would take me to the library. My father introduced me to the old Godzilla movies. I mean, the cheap ones with the guys in the rubber suit, Godzilla
Yeah.
movies and those kinds of things. And so, they were always an influence. And then, modern day writers, I think like N.K. Jemisin and or
Mm.
Victor Laval. I think when I was really trying to find my voice, I think reading them really helped a lot.
Okay. Um, so I have a bit of a bad conscience because usually in my old role as an anthropologist, I would, continue this line of questioning and find out more about this. But in this series, I try to really jump in
Mhm.
with you and everybody else at the
Sure.
deep end,
Okay.
and yeah, get to know what your understanding is of racism.
hmm
What's your understanding? You can maybe also give us some examples. It's a tough
Oh
one, it's a
goodness. I
big
mean,
one. It's
I study as an academic historian. I study slavery and emancipation, so
yeah.
I get an earful, right? And so, you know, um, what can I say when I talk about racism? I'm actually at the point in class right now where we're talking about scientific racism
Yeah.
and the switching over, I guess, in many ways from earlier ideas of perceptions may have been, people being religiously different or something of the sort, and how
Yeah.
biological racism happens to rise along the same time, the early times with both slavery and the colonization conquest of the New World, right? And so
Yeah.
racism to me is this ideology that has to be created in many ways to justify it. It doesn't mean people didn't notice that other people were different before. It
Mm.
wasn't that people weren't ethnocentric, but an entire institutional framework to justify crimes against humanity. I think that's
Yeah.
where racism itself, when we think about racism, is again this larger institutional, systemic system and structure of power. I think this is where it has its modern day origins. And again, people will say, well, people always noticed people were different. I said, yeah, but
Yeah.
I'm not talking about people noticing differences. I'm not talking about people even having ethnic ideas of like, well, we're Germans and we're better than
Yeah.
Swedes or something.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the entire structure of how we understand racism today, in which you categorize certain human beings based on biology on this hierarchical scale, and then deem those things you can do to them or not do to them based on that. I think that is what I constitute as racism. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for making that clear for us. I'm also curious. I haven't asked this question before, but it's occurred to me a couple of times, and I can't help it. For in my mind, the term pathology always comes up when I think of
Yeah.
racism. It's very hard for me not to think of it as a pathology. How do you see
Yeah.
this? Is that justified? Is it silly? What?
Yeah. I mean, I think I understand why people are looking for it to be a pathology. Look, I think people have studied this for a long time, and it's really
Mm,
interesting. There are a lot of, especially people of color, who have written works, and psychologists who are simply like, I don't understand this thing. Like, I need to
mm,
understand it. And some people have approached it from a historical framework, from psychological. I understand the case for pathological. The only thing I would pull back from that is I think in doing so, we're always trying to give agency to the people who are taking part in this, right? And I
yeah.
never want to take away and say, well, perhaps they have it's something pathological and it's
Yeah.
something mental, or, there was a whole ideology at one time. Maybe people are just naturally, biologically, some people are prone that way. But
Mm,
besides the fact that that's all really essentialist and it kind of gets you back trapped in the same loop,
yeah.
I also think it lets the people who do these things off the hook,
Yeah.
right? I think it's people who do these things choose to do these things. They can have another out. They can have another
Mm,
avenue. And there's something about choosing to engaging in this is giving them something. And so I think since they have the agency to choose to be in it, I don't ever want to take away that agency and say,
yeah.
well, there must be some other underlying cause that they can't help themselves
Yeah.
in doing this. And no, I think people can help themselves. I think
Yeah.
that's part of the problem. Yeah.
Okay. Um, and then looking at the present moment, looking at the situation in the US, just to get
Yeah.
a bit more specific, what are aspects of contemporary US racism which you think are particularly crucial to consider or to fight against?
I think the United States has always had it. I mean, in let's say the Western world in general, right? I can
Mm,
go to Europe and find it's not surprising that some of the same issues in which authoritarian rule and can pop up over issues of immigration and these
mhm,
kinds of things. It's not shocking that it's happening in many parts of Western and Eastern Europe, just like
yeah.
it's happening in the U.S. Right? We're seeing these same ideologies, but again, these things are built on. I go back and say these things are built on long institutions, and I think one of the problems we've had is that people tend to see racism as as this one person said something mean about this other person,
Yeah.
or I didn't like them. And I think it's better to think of them in the US or anywhere else as these long entrenched systems, right? Like
Mhm,
Europe has to go out and colonize all of these various peoples, and they have to categorize them, they have to justify it.
yeah.
And so Europe is going to create all kinds of reasons to justify its colonialism, right? This is what Edward Said writes about in Orientalism, right? That
Yeah.
the entire notion of the East and the Orient is created to justify the Occident's imperial motives, right? And so
Yeah.
everything becomes engaged in that, whether it's a work of art or it's how you decide to categorize and understand science, right? Nothing
Mm,
escapes it. And so I think when it comes to the US, when it comes to anywhere else, what I think we probably have to get back to is just understanding that the institution of racism permeates everything.
mm,
And I think in understanding that, it may have people, perhaps it may allow some space for people to not react immediately.
yeah.
So if you say there's racism, people react and they get offended.
Mhm,
If they understand, well, we're all swimming in in an immersion of it,
yeah.
and it makes certain, therefore, we all participate. I always use it much like sexism, for instance, right? Like you said, you want to discuss. We're all swimming in sexism.
Yeah.
right? We're all swimming in homophobia. None of us are clean of it because it's literally it's tied together, tying together the systems and the cultures in which we live in. And so I
Mm.
think understanding like that, understanding it that way is important so that it doesn't become just this interpersonal thing. People understand, okay, it's this larger thing, and how am I being impacted by it, no matter who I am?
Yeah.
How am I being impacted by it? And then how can I find ways to mitigate it in some ways for
Yeah.
people around me, for myself, and whatever, what have you? Yeah.
Yeah, so as you say, racism can operate at this large scale and across gigantic time frames. And then when I was speaking to some of my earlier interviewees, what also came up a lot, and which I had to grapple with, because growing up in Switzerland, it's racism is a bit more or often a lot more stealthy, and
Hmm.
as one of my interviews called it clumsy. And so at kind of the other end of the scale, we
Yeah.
have these microaggressions. Could you
Yes.
talk
Yeah.
to that
Yeah.
briefly?
I mean, and I always say microaggressions work in the way that, right, the atom works with the universe, right? It's
Mm,
like
yeah.
microaggression is not separate from the macro thing. It's just the trickle down manifestation.
Mm,
And so that may be, hold 1 second, please.
yeah.
You're getting kind of wild in there. And so, yeah.
Yeah.
And so, as I was saying, I think that, I don't think the two are separate, right?
Yeah.
I think that's another way. We need to think of them as enmeshed. Simply because we're talking about on that interpersonal level doesn't mean it's not also existing at the level we face on the lower level. And that's not incorrect, right?
Yeah.
Those are certainly things that are happening that impact us. And so I don't want to say they're not important, but I think, yeah, I think that we have to see it as all related in
Yeah.
many ways, right? And is equally valid as tackling the larger systems. Because for most people, it's going to be dealing with things happening on a personal level. And of course, I think, like you were saying, in Switzerland, it's different. And that's the thing about racism. I mean, it's not going to manifest the same everywhere,
Yeah.
right? It's going to be different in Brazil. Their very notions and systems are going to be different in the US.
Yeah.
But different does not mean absent.
Yeah.
I've seen this a lot, like in traveling on book tours, and I've been to Spain and France, and
Uh-huh.
say, "Oh, it's so terrible they have the racism in the U.S." And I was like, "Is France and Spain free?
Friends of all
No,
places.
not the. I said not Spain, like the original colonizers. You guys are
Uh,
like I was in Portugal, and they were like, "Yeah, it was so terrible." I was like, "You guys started the transatlantic slave
uh,
trade. I just want to put that out there." And so
yeah.
there has been, that's a whole other discourse, but there has been, I've noticed over the past, I guess, decade or so, I've noticed there's this notion that racism exists in the United States
Yeah.
and elsewhere. No, 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 no. It doesn't really exist in these
Yeah.
places. And it's an interesting dynamic. And I have my own reason for thinking so. I think it has to do with overexposure of the United States. I think it has to do with
Yeah.
US media. And so people can easily point to an issue like George Floyd or police brutality
Mm.
that occurs because once it happens in the US, it blows up. But the same thing may be happening in Belgium in a different way, but
Yeah.
you don't see it that way,
Yeah, exactly.
right?
There's a
So yeah,
tremendous
it's an interesting
saturation.
phenomenon. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a tremendous saturation of the cultural sphere by US contents.
Yeah.
Um, so many axes of discrimination.
Hmm.
Very briefly, putting your finger on sexism.
Yeah.
Uh, how do you view it, and in which ways do you think it's most important to combat it?
I mean, that's I mean, it's like it's one of those things that just is, and in our age in the
Mm.
U.S. and I know in some other places in the world, it seems that like it and racism and anti-Semitism, they're all having their comeback, but they
Mhm.
never really went anywhere. It's probably
Yeah.
part of it. And so, yeah, I think sexism, its attendant misogyny and everything else, are those issues that permeate the world and have permeated it for quite a long time, right?
Yeah.
Earlier than racism, certainly,
Yeah.
right? And longer lasting. And then so there are people who are going to suffer all of those things. They're going to get racism and sexism and any other, marginalization that they are
Yeah.
given. And so, I mean, I often use sexism when people are denying racism because I've found that they'll at least admit, okay, yeah, they're sexist,
Yeah.
right? A lot of people don't like to admit that they're sexist, but
Yeah.
I try to sometimes. So I've often used it in that sphere when people don't want to see racism. I say, well, you agree that sexism exists in these things,
Mhm.
but I gotta admit, as we're going into this new old era in which there are these quote unquote men's rights movements and all
Yeah.
these silly things and these ideas of this toxic idea of masculinity. I don't know if I can use it anymore
Mhm.
the same way, because I do think there's this rising spread of people who are just denying that even sexism exists,
Uh-huh.
right? So I think I think what it shows is that I guess we have this notion that when we attack these things in the US, for instance, you have a civil rights movement, you have a women's movement, that
Mhm.
once you tackle these things and you face them, they're all done, they're all gone. We've moved on. And I
Mhm.
think if anything we've noticed in our history in the US, and I guess this can be globally, is that those issues don't often go away. They will
Yeah.
return again.
Mhm.
And you have to be vigilant because there's always going to be a reaction to them. There's going to be a blowback to them that's going to try
Yeah.
to claw back whatever gains that were made. And I think those things are just going to be things that you have to constantly be aware of on that larger macro level, like with racism, on that lower level. I don't know what you call microaggressive sexism.
Mhm.
There's a word for that.
Yeah.
And within all of ourselves, like with anything else, you're gonna have to
Yeah.
combat it. And so, as a writer, you have to be aware of those things and wonder why you're doing those things. Or
Yeah.
there are always epiphanies, like where you're like, yeah, why do I do this with certain girl or women characters, and do I do them for male characters, or things
Yeah.
like the Bechdel test, which I think were fascinating. When you look at
Yeah.
Bechdel test, was this test was given if you look in a movie,
Mhm.
are there more than two women who are prominent in the film?
Ah, yeah.
Yeah. Second, do those two
Talk to
women
each
never
other.
talk to each other,
Yeah.
and do they talk to each other about something other than a man? Right. And so it's
Exactly.
a
Yeah.
simplistic thing, and people have had their criticisms over the years of it. But I
Yeah.
thought it was just a good starting point. It's a good way to awaken people who aren't thinking about it much. At least get
Yeah.
them to see at times. I've used it, and people who might have been like, I'm a little skeptical that that's important. When they actually sat down and thought about it, they were like, okay, wow, that's something I can concretely apply,
Yeah.
right? And I see that it's just a good starting point. I always tell people as writers, especially speaking to male writers, to think about that.
Yeah. 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 It's an excellent point of departure. My partner always does it, and she's told me about it many times, but it's always she who just does it with every single, because you watch
Right?
movies
Yeah.
almost every night. She does it all the time, and I always have to be kind of reminded.
Right. And we,
And
we, we have to be reminded because we don't have
yeah.
to do that.
Yeah.
Right. It's
Exactly.
like I knew another writer was saying that he was writing, and this is another well-known male writer, kind of a mentor to me. In fact, I think I
Mm.
mentioned him already. But he was saying he was writing, and he was talking about a character. One of his characters was a female character, and she was leaving to go out
Mhm.
somewhere, and it was late at night in New York. And his partner read it, and she was like, "This is not realistic."
Yeah.
He told me, he said, no woman who lives in New York is just going to get up and go walk the streets of New York
Uh,
at 1 to 2 a.m. He said, you can do that. He said,
yeah.
if I have to do it, I have to take a whole set of factors. If I'm going to do it, I need a lot to think about
Yeah.
internally and process, right? And so it's those kinds of things, like she would tell him sometimes, like, you have a character parking the car at night and coming back to this. No, you're gonna park
Mm.
the car where
Yeah.
it's just these little things, like as I said, that, like you just said, we don't have to think about them.
Yeah.
It's not something we have to think about constantly.
Yeah.
And so I
Exactly.
think it's almost, you have to train your mind to start being empathetic and thinking about those things, whether
Mm.
it's sexism, whether it's, homophobia and these kinds of things. You have to start thinking about those things if I would say if you want to be a good human.
Yeah. Yeah.
Certainly if you want to be a writer who is being empathetic and creating characters that feel real and lived to the people who have been real and lived in those characters' shoes.
Mm. So we have these two huge, at least in my mind, this at least two, many more huge negative force fields
Yeah.
that influence society. All these different forms of discrimination that have a negative influence. But I also like to think of at least there are many more, but at least one positive force field, which is the one of diversity. So,
Yeah.
what would be your description of diversity, and where do you see its status and significance in the US or maybe even globally today?
Right, right. So I mean, so
Yeah,
you're asking me to describe diversity and my
yeah, and
preferences, yeah,
where you
and its
see it
status in the
significant
U.S.
presently right
Yeah.
now, yeah, because it keeps changing. So, yeah.
I mean, diversity to me is like one of those things that people get really tied up about, but to me it's really simple. It's just
Mm,
everybody. Right? And it means everybody, but within the context of power. Like I remember
yeah.
once someone was worried. I knew someone and they were going to write no, they weren't worried. They were actually told this. They were trying to do like a fantasy middle grade, and they wanted it setting in a very like African inspired setting. And so they're
Mm,
gonna have all black characters. And they were told, well, it's not diverse if it doesn't also have white characters.
yeah.
And I was like, okay. I said, this is where I see you have to define what we mean by diversity, right? Of
Yeah.
course, we're talking about diversity as in general, everyone, right?
Hmm.
Whoever you are, um, race, color, creed, religion, disability, what have you, everyone,
Yeah.
sexuality, everyone. But then, of course, what we mean by diversity and its application in our times has to do with the context of history.
Yeah.
And so,
Exactly.
yes. And so it's like this, it's like you have to have this pluralistic. So we understand diversity in that sense, but
Yeah.
the reason that it's also diverse to have a setting in fantasy with all black characters is because for a very long time, there were no black characters or they were very
Hmm.
negative, right?
Yeah.
So diversity today can also mean that correcting all of these past issues. And this is where we get controversial with people because if you make a black mermaid, people
Yeah.
lose their minds because that is also diversity. And that the very fact that to me, the very fact that people lose their minds shows why there's a need for diversity,
Yeah.
right? If they were just able to accept that and say, oh, no big deal. The
Yeah.
fact that they
Exactly.
lose their minds said,
Yeah.
it turns out we have a problem, right? You're
Yeah.
not used to seeing this, and seeing it has completely altered your perception of your own reality.
A girl who's half fish and whose best friend is also a fish. You've taken this very, very seriously.
Right? And so, whose
That
mentor
is
is a singing
excellent.
crab.
Yeah.
If this is serious to you, there must be something is going on here,
Yeah.
right? I don't think it has to do with seafood or fish. I don't think that's part of it that is upsetting you so much.
Yeah.
And so I think that we have to have this two-tiered conversation about
Mhm.
what we mean by diversity, because then what happens is I think forces who are negative, who basically are trying to roll things back. If you've noticed, they have a way of co-opting the idea of diversity. And
Yeah.
they'll tell someone like this person, oh, if you don't have any white characters in there, then you're being non-diverse. You're being
Yeah.
racist. And that is just a story devoid of context,
Exactly.
right? You've taken away
Taking off your
power, you've taken away
historical
history,
goggles.
you've flattened it, so you
Yeah.
can make this really basic argument to me by taking away the complexity. So I think we always have to have that context, complexity in there, so that when we talk about diversity, we talk about why we need it, why we're
Mhm.
talking about it. If there was never any white supremacy racism, we would not be needing diversity, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and so we have to acknowledge that part before we can get to the diverse part. You can't have the
Yeah.
diversity. It's like people in the US, like the ones who you'll see them playing this game where we don't want to talk about diversity or racism, but we honor Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
Well, what is it he was doing?
Yeah.
right? If you can't talk about the racism part, what are you honoring him for? For having a nice
Yeah.
name? What is it? What is the point, right? And so we have to be careful about people who are doing that because I'll be quite blunt. I don't think people like that are doing it ignorantly. I think they are
Yeah.
bad faith actors,
Mhm.
right? They are simply co-opting these things because they found an easy way to twist around the truth, right?
Yeah.
To,
Yeah.
to, to create these things. And I think we have to be vigilant against that kind of using diversity in a very negative way.
Yeah.
Using the idea of diversity as a cudgel against diversity. What
Yeah.
it's actually supposed to
Like,
be. Yeah.
yeah, turning it on its head.
Yeah. It's actually insidious when you think about it. I was like, you guys are like
Yes.
Sith Lords. That's like
Yeah, it is
some
very,
Dark Jedi stuff right there, right?
very nefarious indeed. So you've done this already quite a bit now. This linking of your profession, in this case, the creative arts, and these
Yeah.
topics, and super bluntly, sledgehammer wise, how do you, as a writer, as a person of the pen, think that the different forms of discrimination can be addressed, countered, etc., in literature, in writing? What are the opportunities? What are the obstacles?
I mean, to me, the opportunities are vast, right? We have this creative ability, we have this media and ability to reach people, and so yeah, I think that there's a lot of capability. But the question, but of course, at the same time, I say that that's left to every individual what you want to do and how you want to do it, right? I always tell people because there are some people who feel put upon, especially if they are, people of marginalized background. You feel a pressure like I have to talk about this. And I said, you can if you want to, and if you don't want to, don't. Right? It is not your job. It is everyone's job, actually. Right? And actually, I guess this is where I understood when there were some who were saying that people from non-marginalized backgrounds, right, should not write certain characters. And I understood that. I understood why. I empathize with that because they were saying it's been done so terribly.
Yeah.
Right? That you need to take a break.
Yeah.
So I fully agree. Or also, when you're doing so, there are times because of those systemic structures, a publisher will publish your work before they publish someone from that particular marginalized background.
Yeah.
Right? And so for all those reasons, I said, I do think people from non-marginalized backgrounds to think about before they write a full book, right? I should think about it before I write a book, about maybe where I have all queer characters, and I am trying to promote the book in a certain way when there may be people who are queer writers who are not getting that opportunity, right?
Yeah.
And I do think about that. On the other hand, however, this is again, we have the complex acts. People doesn't have to be a simple either or.
Yeah.
I don't think it should be the burden of every marginalized person to have to write that, right? If you're a queer writer and you want to write other things, you don't even want to write queer people or talk about certain issues, you should be allowed to, right? And I think as all of us as writers, we should all be, well, I want my characters to reflect the world.
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't have to be some kind of formula where you're like, I'm going to have one black character, I'm going to have one Asian character. It doesn't have to be like that. You should simply, I don't know. To me, it's like if I write works like set in our modern world and I don't reflect its diversity, it doesn't feel real to me.
Yeah.
Right. And so I always tell as writers, you just have to get to that state where, if like you're writing just all white characters and it's set like in New York,
Yeah.
like
Friends.
For a second, what's happening? It's set in Paris. Like, think about what you're saying here. And so while I get the idea, just to make this is going on. I'm kind of rambling, but make this idea. I think it's everyone's right. So I think yes, if you are a straight male white writer, it's your burden too to create characters of color. And I think, as we were talking about off screen, I think when people do interviews, they should ask you as well, what do you think about the diversity? I would love white writers to get asked questions about diversity just all the time, right? You don't just have to ask me. You don't have to ask the Asian women writers, the queer writers. You can just
Exactly.
ask straight white male writers. So, what do you think about the state of diversity? I would love to hear the answers. I don't hear
Yeah.
that much, right?
Yeah,
And so,
no.
if anything, I want people to normalize that, just out
Yeah.
of left field. Yeah, you're a big time writer, so how do you think? What do you think about the state of diversity in publishing and writing, and how it
Yeah.
could be better? And I want to see what the answers are because I
It
get asked this
it
question
might
all
be a
the
little
time.
fumbling. Yeah.
I get asked all those questions all the time, and I was like,
Yeah.
why not?
Yeah.
Everyone should get a chance.
I definitely I agree. Unfortunately, I haven't. Well, unfortunately, this is a silly way to put, but I haven't had that many
Yeah.
white interviewees yet. But the ones I've had had very interesting answers. But I
Yeah.
guess they were also a bit primed from the channel. So yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And cutting straight to the chase again. You as person of color or a black writer, your journey through the realms of publishing and of academia. What have been some of your encounters, confrontations with discrimination, and how do you deal with these situations?
I mean, it's again. I guess for me, part of it again is in thinking this is the sea I swim in,
Mm-hmm.
and so I'm not saying I'm not shocked. Shocking things can happen, but it's just been a matter of dealing with certain things and when they arise and understanding that of course they're going to arise. Like, why wouldn't they? And so, yeah, I've experienced it in writing. I've experienced it going through academia. And as any person of color, you never write off, assume so. Right. I said I always tell people, by the time someone says racism, a person of color says racism, understand we have done the math. We've gone back. We've second guessed ourselves 10 times. We have asked about 5 other people to put the story by them. We do out of our way. Very likely, this is about the 4th such microaggression that's happened, and we're trying to figure out if it's just us or what have you. So understand, by the time the accusation of racism comes, understand there's like a mountain of evidence that is sitting in the background that we are ready to pull out as exhibit A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So yeah, I mean it's just been an experience in kind of trying to understand at times when something should be taken head on, when it's a teaching moment, when I feel like doing a teaching moment. Those kinds of things. And, I guess I've been fortunate enough that people have been receptive in the space that I've been in. I know well from other people who have spoken of experiences where people were not as receptive or not as open. And so I think I'm fortunate for that. I mean, as I've said before, I think that it is not an accident that certain books that I've written dealing with these issues of racism directly, or even just doing something radical like having, a black woman or a girl on the front cover, which is a radical thing, right? I said, these things would not have happened if I tried to publish 5-10 years before I did. I said, because I still remember in the 2000 teens when they were whitewashing covers, book covers, right? This is not ancient history. There was an Asian American writer, I believe, and they whitewashed her cover, and it caused like a big storm. I said, do people not remember the last Airbender movie? This stuff was not that long ago.
Very
right. It's not ancient history. It's not like we got to go like some old civil rights stuff with black and white. It's very recent, and so I do not think that many of the works that I had. I mean, also, I've grown as a writer, and certainly part of it is that I think I've just gotten better at the craft, but also. I don't think there were the right people in places to make the determination of what gets published for me to have had access. And so some of the books I'm publishing could not have been published a while back. The question I think I have now is, what will I be saying 5-10 years from now, given the way the state of things in the United States and elsewhere, this anti-diversity push, this push to return back, right, to when maybe you could whitewash some covers or these kinds of things, or simply not have that many diverse writers. We've seen like big television studios we're all into diversity and have closed down those things in the past few years, right?
Yeah.
Like, what does this mean?
Yeah.
And so the real question is, how long will this be sustained? Because again, what I said before, there's this idea of like, oh wow, we've done it. You
Yeah.
don't have to go back and fix it again. And we've seen that's not the case, right?
Mm.
You have to be vigilant. And so far, I will say that in the US at least, with everything going on now, the publishing world has seemed like it has remained the most dedicated towards diversity.
Yeah.
By the way, I think part of it is, look, it's cold hard facts. I think the idea of pulling away from diversity in our times is simply it might be something that satisfies people emotionally for whatever reason. It doesn't make any economic sense.
Yeah.
Right? In our age, you have to sell to vast amounts of people. I think that's why whitewashing in movies don't work anymore. I think there was something that when I was younger, I might have put up with it and I might have laughed, but I think you've had another generation or two who's like, I'm not watching that. And if you notice, those kind of movies have flopped.
Yeah.
People don't want to see whitewashed anymore. And so it's going to be this interesting tension between people trying to put genies back in the bottle and pull everything back to this other time, as opposed to the fact that the audience itself is growing more diverse. The audience is growing more global, right? You can't just go back to making white mermaids all the time.
Yeah.
It's done, right? You can't have all straight characters all the time. It's just not going to work because the audience is not that anymore, right? And it never was, but now the audience has grown even more diverse and more demanding. And so I think those forces will be in tension. And so far, it seems that, knock on wood, the literary world seems to understand this. And it's like, yeah, going back is not going to help our bottom line.
Yeah.
And so it's going to be interesting to see.
What a noble motive.
Whatever motive, right? And, this is a great tension between, there's a moral motive and there's an economic motive. And I think I would like to tell everyone that the moral motive, simply putting it out there, is going to do it. But realistically, we know it doesn't work. People need that other motive, that other incentive as well. They need to see that Black Panther did well at the movies.
Yeah.
For there to be more.
Oh, Lord.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Just to stay a little tiny bit in this lane. I don't know how much how comfortable you are with this term, or how much you like it or dislike it. I'm not clear myself, but I'm gonna ask you. And I don't want to be too provocative, but why Afrofuturism?
Afrofuturism. I mean, it's interesting because Afrofuturism is a ideology that the person who coined it actually was a white scholar who coined the term Afrofuturism, trying to understand certain cultural movements in the U.S. And certainly, I think it's a great term to describe certain things. I loved hip hop growing up, like early hip hop. Like thinking about early hip hop as Afrofuturist to me is fascinating because you think about people who taking turntables and microphones and using technology and doing something different with it, with the speakers. Or if you listen to a lot of early hip hop, it has this almost electronic sound, and they talk about future and robots, Planet Rock and these kinds of things. And so there's this. I like that notion of there's Afrofuturism, and people who've traced it and said like, part of it is this counter where I'll give it an idea. When I was younger and Star Wars came out, I was not allowed to go see it.
Yeah.
And my mother, West Indian who moved to the United States, basically said, "Oh, you're not going allowed to go see Star Wars because there are no Black people in it."
Yeah.
And I was like, "Whoa!" I didn't understand this. I'm like 5, 6, and I was like, "Well," she's like, "What are they trying to say? There are no Black people in the future?" She's like, no. She said, "You're not seeing that film, right?" And so I tried to get her. I said, "Well, no, it's actually set in a place far, far away, a long, long time ago. So it's actually set in the past." Like, well, if it's set in the past, there were no white people before Black people, so you're definitely not seeing it. And so all this to say, there was long been this notion of that Black people just weren't going to be in the future.
Yeah.
You just don't need to include them in futuristic things, right? They're
Yeah.
even alien there in the future, right? They're like, what are they doing there? And you still see
Yeah.
it in fandom, right? Why are these black people in Star Wars? Or
Mm.
they shouldn't be in these spaces. And so I think Afrofuturism, what it showed is like, first of all, black people have long been dreaming themselves into the future,
Mhm.
right? There are black writers from the 19th century in the US talking about, the 21st century
Yeah.
and what the 21st century might be like and thinking about race. W.B. Du Bois is thinking about a comet, that comes to Earth and causes all these changes. And so black people have always been dreaming themselves in the future, whether it's hip hop, whether it's Janelle Monáe, it's this Afrofuturistic,
Yeah.
talking about what is it, Android or what have you.
Mhm.
Black people have always had to dream themselves into the future because the future people who write about the future try to act like they weren't there,
Yeah.
right? And that can simply be neglect, but it can also be chilling because it's trying to say
Yeah.
you don't think you're going to make it,
Yeah.
right? What does that mean?
Uh-huh.
And so, for that reason, I think Afrofuturism is a powerful term. At the same time, all terms are limiting,
Mhm.
right? I've had people they'll sometimes look at a work that I did and they'll be like, "That's Afrofuturism." I was like, "But it's set in the very, very far past.
Yeah.
There's swords and stuff. There's not one futuristic element." So
Yeah.
part of it is Afrofuturist, and I do think that this has to do with marketing. I think marketing ended up slapping labels, and so they'll slap labels on things, and I'll laugh, and I was like, there's nothing futurist about this. There's Afro,
Yeah.
but there's no future. So how? And so I think I understand that the term can be, and then people have, Afrofuturism is very much, I think, I think Afrofuturism was like an umbrella that was open to everyone. But
Mhm.
there are people who would say like, well, what about me? I'm from the Caribbean and I'm Afro-Caribbean, or
Yeah.
I am even in the United States. I'm from the Midwest. Or I'm from the South, and I think
Yeah.
Afrofuturism has a very Eastern Seaboard thing. And so,
Mm.
people have created. I've heard people have created things for the Caribbean. I've seen people thinking about Afro-Latin type futurism. How's it different? Within Africa itself? And the way
Yeah.
I think of it, I think of Afrofuturism as the umbrella term.
Yeah.
All those different ideas of future. I think it came up with it first, and then they plugged it in. But then over that, I always tell people, and then I call myself a speculative fiction writer. And sometimes I write Afrofuturism, and sometimes I write Afrofantasy,
Yeah.
right? Or I do retrofuturism, which I think steampunk has. And so
Mm.
I think I understand the purpose of the term.
Yeah.
But I think it's complicated, like everything else.
Mm.
Yeah.
But yeah, it has many different
It
uses.
has a lot of different uses, and some people use it badly. Like I said, I think marketers and people doing marketing really use it badly, or writers who will ask me silly questions about my book,
Okay.
a book being Afrofuturist, and I was like, "There's nothing futurist
Well,
whatsoever." I think that people have to It reminds me when I was teaching class, and the term African American, which makes a lot of sense in the United States, the term African American is created. But I'd be teaching Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, and somebody would say,
Yeah.
well, the African Americans of Nigeria. And I said, do you mean some African Americans who moved to Nigeria? And what they were just using, it's synonymous for any person of African descent. They were using it synonymous for black. And I said, that's where Afrofuturism can't simply be a synonymous for black, which I think is
Yeah.
the problem sometimes that you run into.
Yeah.
It's a word that means a thing.
Yeah. I think it's very hard sometimes for people to be careful with language if they're not using it on a
But I think it also has to
thinking
do
about it.
be kind of honest, the people who often use it that way were not people of color themselves.
Mhm.
And to me, I would sit back and think about that idea of categorizations, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, you're not even thinking about what the word means. You just hear it and think black,
Yeah.
right? Because black is simple and flat. It doesn't have to have the complexity of, well, no, I'm a person from Nigeria, from southeastern Nigeria, right? I wouldn't be
Yeah.
African American, but it tells me that there was really no investigation of what African American was supposed to mean, a person of African descent from the United States. It was just when you saw it in your mind, the mind just said, the way the mind, all human beings categorize black.
Yeah.
Done.
Yeah.
I said, and that is interesting to unpack.
Yeah.
Right? The same thing with Afrofuturism, right? If you see everybody knows what futurism means.
Mhm.
You get
Yeah.
Afro, but to them it just means, oh, it's black.
Yeah.
That's it. And I can put that over here in the black stuff. I don't have to think about it in a complicated way. Yeah.
I'm gonna flip back just a tiny bit, and one of my previous interviews, Fatima Mouni, she's a playwright, and she had done a lot of racism, anti-racism, diversity workshops. And at one point she said, "Ich will nicht mehr die Rassismus-Tante sein. I don't want to be anti-racism anymore." She doesn't want to be this expert who always has to talk about this topic.
Yeah.
And I was curious, what's your take on this kind of racism fatigue?
Yeah, I mean, it can be. I think, like we had said in the beginning, it can be like a woman who's constantly asked about sexism or a queer identity. Like, I'll go to panels, for instance, and somebody noticed this, and it's not somebody, many people have noticed this. You're invited to a con, and they'll put me on panels, and there'll be panels about diversity or panels about Afrofuturism, and I say I'm fine with those panels. In fact, I think that I would not want a panel that's supposed to be talking about diversity and it's all white guys up there. That would be weird, right? I think we have to be at the table when we're having those discussions. I don't with Afrofuturism, right? I expect the panel should have people of African descent, right? Doesn't mean that you can't have anybody else, but the majority should at least be people of African descent, right? So you balance it out with gender and sexuality, so it can, so we can get a well-rounded. That's great. We want well-rounded experiences. At the same time, I sometimes I've started asking now. I said, "Hey, can I be on another panel? Maybe I just want to talk about Star Trek.
Yeah,
I just want to talk about Star Trek, and maybe race will come up during that time. I have a lot of things to say about race in Star Trek or Star Wars or the Wheel of Time, but I just want to talk about it. And so I think there are people who are asking those questions. Like, I just want to talk about why I think, world building with airplanes is cool, right? Or I want to talk about underwater worlds. And it's like, and so it can't be that if you are the person of color or the women or what have you, the marginalized group, that's all that you're on. And there has been that. And I think that's what creates the fatigue, right? Where people feel that I'm constantly putting on these things, and I'm constantly doing all the work. As I said before, right? I think it's up to everyone to write diverse characters. It can't simply be put on the backs of one group of people. That y'all are in charge of that, because then that can get tiring. It can't be up to me to constantly be talking about issues of racism, and sometimes my books don't. Right? Like my last book, people were like, "Oh, he didn't do this thing in it." Like I said, "Yeah, I talk about different stuff. I have different interests." Right, and these are very different. Like my last two published stories, I did not talk about that at all. Doesn't mean I won't again in the future. I study slavery and emancipation for a living. I do things on media theory and race. Of course, if it's going to show up, but especially in this era. But sometimes I just want to talk about something else, like anyone does. And so, I think I think that publishers should realize that, people put into panels, interviewers, that the rest of us want to talk about a lot of stuff other than that thing.
I was going to say the freedom to be individual and idiosyncratic and
again, normalize asking straight white guys questions like this. Like, do you think there are enough Black writers? And that's what I want to hear. Like, why not ask them? Do you think there are enough Black writers? What about Asian women writers? Do you think there are enough Asian women writers? I want to hear what they got to say. Might get a little awkward, but we can get used to it. I'm sure they'll start to get people thinking, right? I want people to think about things that they think they never have to think about. And it's kind of like, where it's like, I don't have to think about that. Yeah, I'm asking you to think about it. So.
To step out of their mental comfort zone.
And because you're right, and that's going to be a big change, I think. Like you were just saying, just for interviewers or someone who just doesn't expect. I don't expect they would see to ask a white writer that, unless the white writer was purposely a person known for talking about diversity, or they had a main character. Then they would ask them, but. I don't see them asking, I sometimes, because you read a book with a lot of people of color in it, then I may go back and read a mainstream white writer, and there are many who are getting diversity in there, but then some I'll start clocking, every character here is white, and I've been every single one, right? And you notice it, and so I would like to ask, it's do any of these characters have Black friends? Do they know anybody?
I just had to think of
Yeah.
what you said just now. It reminded me of the other week. I was like, oh, I want to go back and read some Richard Ford because I
Yeah,
used
yeah,
to really love Richard Ford. And I went back and it was painful. Like I
yeah,
did because
yeah,
back in the day I didn't realize it because I was swimming in this medium
yeah, exactly. You just
of
expect them to
whiteness.
be.
Yeah.
You expect them to be, right?
Yeah.
There's a great thing that people have done where maybe it's changing now, but people of my age grew up like in the 70s, 80s. You would ask them if they were artists or writers, what was
Mm.
your first character? And nearly all of them said, "Oh, I tried to draw a white guy
Yeah.
as my first comic book character
Mm.
or my first writing character," right? Because
Mm.
that was just consciously what was there. Luke
Yeah.
Skywalker looked like what he looked like, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
All your heroes looked a certain way, right?
Yeah.
Superman looked a certain way, and so it wasn't even in your mind like I'm going to draw. And I think that's changed. I've noticed people
Yeah.
like this, but that's changed because people are purposely making an attempt to put these things out there. They're getting a chance
Yeah.
now to put these things out there. We always say all of us like one of the things people will say like, so what is like, you have all these people of color coming to science fiction. I'm like, hold on, wait a minute. We were always here. We were always into this stuff.
Yeah.
All that's happened is we're now getting a brief chance to get the spotlight.
Yeah.
But there's nothing new about us in these spaces as far as
Mm.
being in these spaces and being consumers. We were always here.
Yeah.
Yeah, we just didn't complain. We mostly laughed when all the characters were white. We didn't complain that the mermaid was a white lady.
And
Girl, let's call it.
it's
You guys, however, one black elf or a black dwarf, and you're ready to tear the place up.
yeah. I guess you're alluding to
They're
the
like, that's
rings
just
of power
unrealistic.
debate.
Not the movie with a talking dragon, is it? The
Uh,
book with a talking dragon is
is-
unrealistic. Yeah, anything can
yeah.
happen. It's
Yeah.
fantasy.
Yeah. It's
I'll still
really.
get people who write me and they'll be like, well, I don't think that would make sense. And I get what you're saying, but like somebody tried to write me a full treatise once on my blog about why all the dwarves in Middle Earth have to be white because they would have all been intermixed. I said, you put a lot of energy into that. I said, rather than just saying, hey, maybe there's some black ones, roll
Uh,
down.
yeah.
Right? You wrote me like a page.
Oh man, that's a lot of
Talk about
energy.
why the society had to be homogeneous. I was like, what if the dwarves came from different places and they all just mingled together like you would have like in a city like London or New York or something?
Yeah. Yeah. This.
But what about the fact that they're dwarves and they have magical things, and so maybe we don't have to think that deeply about it.
Yeah. Thanks for touching on that because I was did this debate about rings of power. It was very upsetting, and it's
It's
good for
really
somebody
ridiculous.
to put it so clearly.
It's like, it's like what you guys like. I would say there's talking dragons.
Mm.
I think you don't have to get that technical with it.
Yeah. Okay, we're already on to the penultimate segment, and
Yeah.
it's non-trigger trigger, and I'll throw these few expressions at
Sure.
you, and you can riff with them, or
Okay.
maybe you can even just pass if you don't want to, whatever suits you. Okay, ready?
Sure.
Post-racial USA.
Not happening anytime soon. United States is not
Samuel,
post-racial anything.
yeah, unfortunately. Samuel R. Delaney.
Oh, legend. Also, it looks like Santa Claus.
Yeah, it does. 2028.
Hope we're all here.
Uh,
Hope we're not all living in a virtual AI simulation.
oh, Lord. Then Black Empire.
Oh, George Schuler is who I think about. The writer of Black Empire, one of the most interesting pieces of work. Interestingly, because Schuler actually detested notions of Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism, and he wrote that as a joke. But it says something to me that black writers, the serials, and reading it, black readers were fascinated by it. He could not
Yeah.
understand. And interesting because George Schuler, if you know anything about his life, the latter part of his life, he lost it. He went extremely right wing,
Yeah.
like called Martin Luther King the syphilis of the civil rights movement, was just
Oh
out
Lord.
there, like really badly ultra right wing.
Yeah.
And this is the guy who wrote, Black No More and Black
Mm.
Empire. But yeah, and so Black Empire always makes you think of George Schuler as this tragic character
Yeah.
who just, to me, went over the deep end, unfortunately, later in life. Sorry to
Um,
put that downer note.
no, 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 no. It was just it's been sitting a few months on my shelf now, and I
Yeah.
was thinking now I'm gonna have
But
to
it's
go
a
back and grab it.
fascinating read for somebody writing in 1920s, 1930s America,
Mm.
and I always wonder if George Schuler's, even though he detested the black nationalism, he didn't like Marcus Garvey and all these people, and
Mm.
so Black Empire is kind of made to make fun of
Yeah.
them. I said, I wonder if your subconscious was actually a bit more impressed with anything else.
I think
Your
it's not.
subconscious was needed to express this, yeah.
Uh, family.
Family. I am here with a young girl right now who is trying to get on camera. No, off camera, ma'am. But that's what I think about when it comes to family. Being a father, it seems.
Trinidad Tobago.
Oh man, Trinidad, where my first earliest memories, good food, extended family, that kind of thing.
Mordor.
What'd you say?
Mordor.
Mordor. Mordor makes me think of one of my favorite series, and I used to call it, in the United States, I used to say anyone living in Florida was living in Mordor, because the governor there was passing all these terrible laws. But now I say, oh, we all live in Mordor now in the United States. The whole country's Mordor now, so that's what I think.
The Ivory Tower.
Oh, I guess that's where I work.
Uh,
Yeah, though, I don't think I would do ivory, but yeah, I think I I have it's interesting being in academia because during these moments, because academia allows you this space to live like this, like petty bourgeoisie lifestyle, but every academic swears they're Che Guevara. And it's like, isn't your endowed chair backed by Exxon? Anyway, but but it's just an interesting space
you
to
have
be
a
in. I
third
love
career
it. I
coming as
love
a
that,
comedian.
we get to think and do all of this, but sometimes, I'll see some of them and they're just like going off, and I'm like, yeah. We go to wine and cheese parties at the end of the day. We're not Che Guevara. The revolution is not happening through us.
Only the t-shirts.
Yeah.
Negritude.
Say it again.
Negritude.
I can't say. I'm sorry. Say that one more time.
Negritude.
Negritude.
Yeah.
Oh, negritude. Yeah, negritude. I think of, I can't think of Martinician writers and all of this. And that's what I didn't think of that. I think of what they were trying to get across as this answer to colonialism.
Yeah.
This answer in many ways. I think about we still deal with it in sense of in trying to combat white supremacy, for instance, you'll see people of African descent have you try to match it. So you say, well, you had Greece and Rome, right? We have, ta-da. You'll say, look at these African civilizations. And I think there's an importance to that. But I do think there's a way that becomes its own trap in judging your equality based on these things. I think it may have been Toni Morrison who said, like, white supremacy does that. It keeps you trying to find something to match, to answer for yourself, to prove your own humanity. And so they'll say, well, you didn't invent things. Well, no. Look at all these things we invented. You didn't have civilizations. Yes, we did. Right?
Yeah.
Or, like mermaids are white. And so you go looking like, no, I have black mermaids. When, maybe the answer to that, like I was at a conference and a guy said, you think maybe people wouldn't get so angry if you didn't take our stuff and you just had your own stuff. And I said, well,
Mm.
I said, what makes Dickens yours
Mm.
and not mine?
Yeah.
I'm in the West. You're in the West,
Uh,
right? I said, maybe my ancestors may have been in the West longer than yours, for all I know,
yeah.
right? What makes Dickens any more yours than mine,
Mm.
right? And I think and all I'm saying here is I sometimes think that there are these ways, and that's why I get with negritude, there are these ways
Yeah.
of our answers to racism might be multifaceted, and we
Yeah.
need to start thinking of them in much more complex ways.
Mm.
And that's what I think negritude offered, right? Like, what if we're not judging ourselves by the standards of what the Western world is saying is quote unquote right or civilized or what have you?
Mm. Then Ursula K. Le Guin.
Oh, the GOAT, right? Probably one of my favorite writers when I was younger, between her and Madeleine L'Engle. Just
Mm.
when I read Wizard of Earthsea, for instance, they had whitewashed the cover. They made the characters white, and I remember reading and understanding, no, they're black and brown, right? And so, yeah, great writer. Had a great chance, by the way, this past summer to meet her son.
Mm.
So great. Oh, look, you made the balloons go up because you did one of these things or something.
This is by mistake.
You did one of these things and it'll create.
Okay.
My daughter knows them all. She can
Okay.
do all the things, but I think you did the thumbs up and the thumbs
Oh,
up.
okay. I'm completely ignorant.
She knows them all. Yeah.
The next one is the N word.
Yeah, the word everybody wants to use. It's funny. My philosophy on the N word has shifted so much. It wasn't used in my household, and
Yeah.
so for a very long time, I was like, it's the worst thing ever.
Uh,
But then all my friends used it, all my music used it,
uh,
and I came to understand what it was like and why marginalized groups may take a word that hurts them and turn it to something else. And so I'm probably now much more. I'm much more open to its usage and understanding, and yet we
mhm.
get into these conversations all the time with people who seem really invested in wanting to be able to say it too. And I
Yeah.
think it's just a great lesson that no, there's some things that are for certain people because of their history and what they've gone through. Again, the context, and you can't have it. I think the best thing I heard was a non-marginalized person was trying to say, why couldn't they use the white word, use the N word? And somebody said, well, you guys have used it enough, huh?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
You've had
yeah,
your time
that's
with
what I
it.
think. And my final thing, by the way, on the N word is, I think debates of the N word, I'm very much over them. I get people
Uh-huh.
want to have them, but to me, like I always say, like what I've just said is probably the spectrum of it. People are
Uh-huh.
either for using it, people are either against using it. I'm talking about within the Black community. I said
Yeah.
I haven't seen any other answers that popped up.
Yeah.
I think we spent a lot of time discussing this, and I think we've reached the limits of the
Yeah.
debate.
The next one, I have to change. I want to change up because I think it might be pertinent to you. Steve Biko.
Say this again.
Steve Biko.
Oh, Stephen
Yeah.
Biko. Oh, wow. Well, I was thinking Stephen Biko. I was thinking there was a movie in the U.S. that came out about Stephen Biko. I think Denzel Washington was in it, but it was the time when they would make white savior movies, so it wasn't really about Stephen Biko. It was about his
Yeah.
lawyer, something like that.
Yeah.
Right? He was a secondary character, and so
Uh,
yeah, that's the first thing I think of. Then I think of the actual Stephen Biko, and I think of someone growing up in his own colonialist society, trying to find ways to empower Black people, right, and to give Black people this important sense of self. And I think this is where we go back to this notion of negritude, where you do have to teach people, like you have to give people an understanding of who they are, because you're trying to combat racism.
mhm.
And so it always comes back to this. I said, like, sometimes we get into these debates over which of these things is correct, but all of them are trying to fight back against this problem.
Yeah.
So they just come up with different methods to do so. But all of it is trying to figure out how can we combat this white supremacy racism that has made us think less of ourselves as human beings and less of our cultures and what have you. How do we fight that? And I think, Stephen Biko is one of those who's trying to do that. Yeah.
Then fantasy epic.
Oh, fantasy epic. I'm a big lover of fantasy epic. Those giant tomes, I always say, like, one day I would like to reach peak white fantasy writer level, where you get to write like a 1,000-page book, and that's your book one, and you got 12 more to go. And so, I'm a lover of those big tome epic fantasy. I'm glad to see that there are more writers of color, Black, Asian, what have you, Indian, who are getting to also Native American place themselves within this genre, because epic fantasy to me comes out of the old epics of mankind, and there's any one place that had them. Beowulf is not the only epic in the world, right?
Yeah.
You can find the Epic of Gilgamesh. You can find West African epics, the Epic of Sundiata. You find them in Asian, Indian cultures, Native American, whether they're oral or they're written. And so, it's a lot of coughing.
It's global. It's global.
And so, I think that it's great that we're getting to see so many different versions of the epic at this time.
Final one, Ebonics.
Ebonics. I think Ebonics, the term, caused a lot of stir in the US, but to me, it was just a term that was really, I think the term people use now is African American vernacular English. And these are languages, right? These are their own languages. People go back and forth, languages, dialects. Depends on where you drop the plumb line. But to me, AAVE is as real as we're now saying, Nigerian Pidgin is, or Nigerian Pidgin is, or Jamaican Patois. And I like that we've reached the time when people are studying those things as languages, when they are deciding to, I hear they're BBC in like Nigerian Pidgin and like maybe in Jamaican Patois. And so, AAVE to me sits on that spectrum. As something, and by the way, all of these things are, of course, often ridiculed. They're often made fun of in many ways. And I think they have to be given their own respect, as dialects, as languages, are equally as important and valid as others. Yeah.
Thank you very much. We move on to the last section, which is about your personal practices and some of your recommendations. So I was thinking, in your own life, maybe on a daily, weekly, yearly basis, what is some of the stuff of the doings that have really worked out for you, have had a positive impact?
Yeah, you talking about towards writing, especially?
No, just in general. It could be writing, seems likely,
so, I mean,
or also
I was
other
gonna say for
parts.
writing, writing certainly. Writing became my way of kind of escaping, wanting to get my thoughts down. I'm trying to get back into comics, things that give me joy. I still love reading, right? I love a good TV show, love a good documentary, right? Still like to cook, watch a game whenever I can. Now I watch less sports, but I listen to a lot of sports radio.
Okay.
I found that I want to hear the play-by-play more than I want to watch. And so
wow,
that's become an
fascinating.
interesting phenomenon, right? But it allows me a lot of time. I can put it on in the background while I'm doing something else. I don't have to watch it. Being a father and learning those ropes, that's always a thing. Like right now, I have two people who desperately want to hop on camera, and I'm telling them they can't. And so they are doing all sorts of things around me right now. Yes, and you need a tissue, so go get a tissue. Yes, and so, been fun. Husband, father, balancing that writing life and everything else,
And then I guess organically connected to that, what do you recommend? Books, movies, series? What do you say? Hey guys,
let's see. The
ladies.
book that I just read that's pretty good. Tanana Reviews The Reformatory.
Okay.
Great Tanana
Okay.
Review.
Cool.
One of the best writers of horror and Black women writers of horror that we have. So definitely recommend that. What's a TV show? I'm trying to. What am I watching? I'm watching Severance on Apple TV because it's good. And
Beyond good.
I found shrink. Go to Apple TV. I'm also watching a show called Shrinking on there. Apple TV has, I said, like some of the best shows that are streaming, and then Apple does not advertise them at all, so nobody knows about them. And so, yeah, those are some things that I'm watching right now. Music-wise, what am I listening to? I was listening to Doechii. That's what I was listening to. Basically, that's it.
She's a rapper or R&B? I'm not sure. I've
A little bit of
seen
both.
a little bit.
Let's call her hip hop. Let's call her
Okay,
rapper. Yeah,
okay.
hip hop. Yeah, just want to grab me too. Yeah,
Um,
very creative.
Actually, I'm curious in terms of literature, like classics, well, or like say, stuff that's not like totally contemporary. Are there some books that stand out in your mind, that
So just recently, I read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Right, going for keeping it in genre. And what was amazing to me was that I realized I think I'd read the book when I was much, much younger. And so reading it again, what struck me was how much visual media had pushed the book out of my head. And I was like, oh, there's no Igor in this. There's no Tesla lightning, right? Nothing that you think of. There's not the monster with the bolt on his head. All these things that come out of the movie Frankenstein. Very different from the book. And there's nothing wrong with the movie Frankenstein. It's its own genre, but it was just, to me, how much I think media can impact, right? So it pushed the book completely out of my head. And the book is so different in so many different ways. And so that probably sticking with me because of that. But then, my classics are like Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. I can read that book at any time and still be blown away by it, right? And so, yeah, works like that, and then I always think there are a lot of writers who I think, Black writers who do modern classics like Octavia Butler or, those kinds of works, I think, or books by Samuel Delany, these kinds of works, I think that kind of laid that foundation for a lot of writers today. Across race, creed, or what have you, right? Or Charles Saunders was doing Afro fantasy when no one was in the 70s.
Yeah. Then finally, the very last one is some questions or some thoughts that keep coming back to you, that are maybe haunting you or pushing you, that early in the morning, in the middle of the night, stuff that just keeps circling about in that head.
So I think our color and atmosphere here in the US, and I think it's also taking root globally, where exactly things are going on a political level, social level. What kind of world are we creating? I mean, all those things, I think they weigh on my mind. You have 2 6-year-olds, they certainly weigh on your mind. Whether it's environment or anything else, issues of equity and other things. Because again, you get this moment of thinking, well, we've solved those things, we're moving forward. And when things snap back, well, now what's the plan? Right? And so, yeah, those things unfortunately have been on my mind way too much. Will probably end up coming out in my writing.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Phenderson. That's
thank you.
Was really hey, thank you so much. This was really delicious.
No problem.
Yeah.
Okay.
All the
right.
best with family, writing, everything.
You have a good day.